Hi, hello, and welcome back to the HII Method. My name is Jen Hatz. I am the host of the HII Method podcast and also the founder of the HII Method, a holistic, integrative, and innovative approach to assessing and optimizing human health, well-being, and performance. And I'm partnered with Neuroforce One, a human performance company that has been training champions for years. And they offer training and assessments in their facility as well as remote options available. And I wanted to talk today about blood glucose and how I kind of started to, plant some seeds throughout a few episodes here about blood glucose and what it is and why it matters and what we do about it. And so I guess we're just going to kind of continue on with that thread that has been threaded. So blood glucose is this very important part of how you function. That's one of the reasons why your blood is so important, is because it's carrying this very highly important energy known as glucose all throughout your body, specifically carrying it up to your brain, where your brain relies on that glucose as its primary energy source, but also the rest of your body and even just your red blood cells require that glucose as its primary energy source. So this is, if there's like one big picture overarching theme of why you need to have blood glucose just in general, it's because it's that primary energy source, and it needs to be in this stable, at least a consistently stable circulating amount in order to provide that energy across the board to all of these very specific, very important organs, specifically for your brain. And so alterations in that blood glucose concentration could be detrimental to you in a variety of different ways. And what I want to talk about today, though, is really what would happen if your blood glucose was not regulated. And there's a variety of different ways in which this could play out and what this could look like. But I'm going to share with you a story, actually, specifically about what it would mean for having those changes in your blood glucose regulation, specifically something that is not within your control, which is, I think, maybe a different way to view this entire topic anyway, because everything that I talk about and everything that I preach over and over is trying to, I guess, enlighten and elevate our understanding of what is within our control. And especially when it comes to, in this case, something as important as regulating your blood glucose, what is within our control, so that way we can have that very important stable blood glucose concentration versus what maybe is not within our control. So to share with you a little story about something that in some ways when your blood glucose is not really within your control. And it actually goes back to some summer camp times, some little summer camp experience that I had. So this was years ago when I was studying to be a dietitian. And so I was in school, I was in grad school at that time. And this was during summertime. There was a camp that was specific for diabetics, for type 1 diabetes. And it was a kids camp, and it was also a sports camp. So if all of that sounds like a whole lot, it's because it was. So it's a youth sports camp. So all these kids are very, very active during this summer camp. It's meant to be this like active sports camp, but it's a camp that was specific for type 1 diabetics. So type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disorder. So your body, an autoimmune disorder would mean that your body is in some way attacking its own cells. And depending on what type of autoimmune disorder it is going to indicate what types of cells your body is basically attacking its own cells of that certain type. And so you end up having these carryover effects of the disorder itself, of the actual autoimmune disorder itself. So type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disorder. So the body, the pancreas specifically, the cells within the pancreas that secrete insulin, those cells are being instead attacked by the body's own immune system. So the body's attacking itself. And so what happens then is that in type 1 diabetes, in this autoimmune disorder, the body, or the pancreas specifically, is no longer producing insulin, which is a very important hormone that you produce in order to help take glucose out of your blood and take it into the cell, where it is then used for those very important properties, those very important processes of energy, and being able to oxidize that energy and use it. So if that insulin is not there in order to do its job of taking the glucose out of the blood, then the glucose stays in the blood. And so you end up having this high blood glucose that circulates at this high concentration. The glucose never gets into the cell, so it never does what it has to do. But it's also this constantly circulating high glucose, which puts you at risk for some pretty adverse and scary effects like coma and death, potentially. So it's a very critical type of a situation to have to continue to monitor for type 1 diabetes if someone has type 1 diabetes. Now, because it's an autoimmune disorder, it's not necessarily something that you're just born with. There tends to be, if anything, an environmental trigger that initiates this now immune response that you're having to your body's own cells. So this is actually an entire topic in itself, just talking about autoimmunity and talking about how this can happen and how the fact that specifically type 1 diabetes, like, used to be called juvenile diabetes because it seemed like it was found more often in younger populations, but that label has been revoked because it's seen now as what it is, that it's an autoimmune disorder, that it can come at any point in time in someone's life. And so I've known a number of different type 1 diabetics of all ages who have been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at all ages. Some they were diagnosed when they were kids. Some were diagnosed when they were young adults. Some were diagnosed when they were already 30s, 40s, 50s, and all of a sudden they were diagnosed with something. So the interesting thing is that everyone who's ever been diagnosed with it, they all of a sudden very quickly learn a whole lot about blood glucose and what it means to regulate it and to monitor it on a continual basis because of how critical it is for them to constantly monitor it. So that's the first of all point to make here is that blood glucose tends to be something that we don't think about until we're all of a sudden faced with the reality that we have to think about it. And so for these types of individuals who are faced with this reality that they have to think about it, it's because of how critical it is. And so part of that learning and awareness that they gain is not just how to track their blood glucose concentrations, but then when and how much insulin to provide to their body. So in this case, their body's not producing its own insulin, so they require insulin from outside the body that they could either have as an injection or as a lot have like a pump that is already attached to them. And so it can sync up with their blood glucose monitoring. So that way their body so that the pump itself is releasing insulin. They, put it into an app basically and schedule for how much insulin is needed based on what they're eating and where their blood glucose is. So it's an entirely intricate process of monitoring your body in real time. Super interesting topic that I get so jazzed when for whatever, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but whenever I do meet a diabetic and we start talking about this, I get so deeply interested in learning about everything that they've learned about their body and how their body's functioning in this state, because it's so interesting to me that they're getting and they're learning how to get this real-time feedback about what they're taking in, how their body is responding, in this case, how their blood glucose is responding to what they took in, and now what to do about it, knowing that their body is not going to automatically produce this hormone to help them to handle basically this blood glucose, to take it out of the blood and into the cell. And so they have this opportunity then to continue within their control to regulate their insulin and how much insulin they're taking in and what other lifestyle factors they are engaging in order to address this continuing blood glucose, regulating this blood glucose, because it's never going to be consistent at one number forever. That's not how it works. That's not how it's supposed to work. Your blood glucose is going to have these nice ups and downs no matter what. Even if you do not have any form of diabetes or insulin resistance, your blood glucose still is going to have these ebbs and flows throughout the day. What needs to happen, though, is this monitoring of it. So I always, like I said, I get jazzed when I talk about this with someone who is a diabetic, because more often than not, they're using some sort of a continuous glucose monitor, some sort of a monitoring system. So that can be, like I said, part of the pump that they have, where it's an insulin pump that's releasing insulin, but it could also be the same contraption, basically the same tool that is also monitoring their blood glucose and spitting it out into an app so that they can see exactly how they're responding, where they're at, what they need to do now. So very cool concept, that this constant feedback about what's going on in your body. Now, I was going to go off on another tangent there about the whole insulin side of things. So before we get into that, because I don't want to turn this into like a whole clinical nutrition like lecture. I want to go back to what I was going to say about sharing the story here. So I've gotten into like some cool conversations though with type 1 diabetics and just learning from them about what they've had to learn about their body. And again, the reason why they've had to learn it is because at some point in time they were diagnosed with it. And then from that diagnosis, they had really no choice but to learn this entire part of their body and how their body functions and what they can do, what is within their control outside of their body to be able to handle what's happening within their body. Super cool concept. So that's probably going to be a really big topic that we're going to talk about for like ever. But so back to the story. So like I said, I've met diabetics at different ages, right? Now, in this case, this was a summer camp for kids. So these are all kids. I mean, youth. These are young people who are type 1 diabetics. And so a lot of times when you have youth, I mean, when you have young people that are in the situation where they're learning these things about their bodies, their parents have to be very heavily involved. Their parents are equally as involved as the individuals because they're all learning this together. Because again, this is not necessarily something that is just a genetic thing. It's an autoimmune disorder that is more often than not triggered from an environmental factor. So the families of the diabetic are also learning about this as the diabetic is learning about this. And so a lot of these kids at this camp, it's not just the kids, it's also their families and their parents who are coming to this camp really. So it was a summer camp, like I said, and this was when I lived in Florida. So this is just to set the tone here. This is hot and humid Florida. Yeah, this is during the summertime, so even more hot and humid Florida. So that already is like a thing to be monitoring when you're talking about a summer camp, right? Now, the next thing is the fact that this is an athletic camp. It's a sports camp. So there's organized activity, like constantly, every hour on the hour, pretty much. Like there is some sort of organized activity for these kids to be engaged in. Some of these kids are athletes, like normally throughout the year, they're normally active and athletic anyway. Some of these kids are not. And this is just their first chance at going to camp because of the fact that this is the third thing here, that this is a diabetic camp. So all of these kids have this one thing in common, that they're all type 1 diabetics. And that one thing in common means that they all require this very in-depth monitoring of their blood glucose at all times and their insulin and how much insulin they're taking in, how much they have already taken in, how much they have been eating, what they're about to eat. So there is a high degree of monitoring on every single one of these kids in this camp under these conditions of them being highly active because it's a sports camp and the fact that this is like a summer camp in Florida, so it's hot. So you have like all of these layers of like critical analysis that needs to be always taking place of like, all right, make sure that these kids are like safe. All right. So on top of all that, right, the fact that these are kids that are type 1 diabetics, so they're learning these things about their bodies. They all, so type 1 diabetes, like I said, can be diagnosed at any point in time. So some of these kids have had they've known this, they've had this diagnosis and they've been learning about their bodies for years, right? So some of these kids are very well equipped to handle situations. They understand their body enough at this point in time that they can figure it out. Some of these kids are brand new to this entire world of understanding this. Some of these kids are like newly diagnosed within the last year before coming to this camp. So they're still learning, they're still figuring it out, and they're also kids. So learning how to like identify things in their bodies and how to communicate that to an adult, how to try to assess and become self-aware. These are all skills that adults don't have. So now we're asking kids to acquire these skills of self-awareness and self-assessment under really critical conditions because it can be life or death if they're not able to communicate to us or we're not able to identify in them. So man, like if I just named off some things that scares you about like trying to work with kids, like there you go. But so my experience in this camp was as a camp counselor. So again, this was during grad school. I was studying for dietetics, studying to be a registered dietitian, and signed up to be a camp counselor for this camp because I was just super jazzed about it, super interested. I wanted to be involved in it in any way. And the fact that there were these like really interesting I guess, cohesive layers of like critical context of like being an athletic camp that is also serving kids with diabetes, right? Just full circle of like nonstop, like mental chaos of trying to keep track of everything. But so going back to my whole story here. So as a camp counselor, I was, of course, I was like the oldest one by years, like years and years, like very much the old one out of the group of counselors. And so as they're splitting up the kids into groups, into age groups, they decided, of course, because they're like, well, you're the oldest one, you can handle responsibility. You're the smart, responsible older one. You look like you could be a parent yourself. Like, you'll have the youngest group of kids because they're going to need the most responsible person to be monitoring them. I'm like, oh, great. So the youngest group of kids is 3 to 5-year-olds. So I had a group of 3 to 5-year-olds, 3 of which were actually 3-year-olds. And so if you've ever had a conversation with a 3-year-old, they're super funny, like to just be around, but man, they are challenging to try to extract any kind of critical information out of. So trying to like be on par with constantly assessing where these 3-year-olds are at just for the sake of their safety, man, that talk about a challenge. But yeah, those 3-year-olds are fun. So of course, so I'm in charge of like the 3 to 5-year-olds. I'm like, great. This is amazing. So as if it wasn't stressful enough, now I got the youngest ones who are that much more novice in communicating really anything that's going on within them. And for me and at that point I was a grad student, like I'm still learning this stuff, but man, that was, yeah. So I loved it though. But and as an added note, if you're like wondering, so this is a sleepaway camp. And so with diabetes, you're continuing to monitor blood glucose and insulin concentrations throughout the day and throughout the night. So as a camp counselor, you're not just monitoring these kids all throughout the day, and every time that they're active, that's acting like insulin. So every time that you're engaging in activity, that's doing the same action of pulling glucose out of your blood the way that insulin would. So there's this constant balancing between monitoring their insulin and how much insulin they've had coming into their body from their pump or from injections versus how much activity they've had and what they're taking in food and fluid-wise, like what they've eaten so far, what they're about to eat, how long it takes, because that's the other thing. None of this is like instantaneous. There's like a little bit of a delay across the board, so you have to like play around with all of it. If there's ever a time to like practice nutrient timing, this is it, because it is like this constant balancing act of playing with the timing of all these different things that are literally like conflicting or antagonizing one another. In some ways, they work synergistically, but you have to like really play around with it and really find that balancing act. So it takes a really high amount of planning and assessing the entire time. And it's day and night, because when you are sleeping, your blood glucose is naturally lowering. So your cells are naturally taking that glucose out of the blood. So you have a risk then for, in this case, for diabetics, when they're sleeping, that their blood glucose drops too low. So you, as the oversight of them, have to continue to monitor them, literally to the point where you're waking them up in the middle of the night because you see that their glucose is low and they have to now eat something or drink something, and then they can go back to sleep. So this is a 24/7 job. And so if it helps to just add a note for your own like mindset about this, the fact that these like small kids are at this sleepaway camp, their parents are there too, but their parents are in a separate part of the camp at their own parents' retreat, because Lord only knows that those parents need to have some time to themselves after being on like high alert of their small child for 24/7 for however long it's been that they're doing this. So those parents, they're there like at the location, but they're in their own separate retreat, and it's their own sleepaway camp for parents. So they get their time, and they also get to be around other parents who are in the same situation too. So it's like a beautiful community that they get to build for themselves across like all these other families, and time to just have to themselves and to not have to be on monitoring duty. So instead, that's my job during this point in time, is to be on monitoring duty. And so with these little 3 and 5-year-old, man, like I learned, not only did I learn so much about everything that I just said about like diabetics and that timing of everything and how critical that monitoring process is, and really the advantage of having different tools to monitor these not only the changes in your blood glucose, but then to monitor very consistently your insulin, this hormone that otherwise we wouldn't be able to monitor in someone who is producing their own insulin. You wouldn't really be able to monitor it to that degree. So super like informative and really interesting experience overall. But I just had to share like part of the story though. So again, so I had these kids, and man, kids at that age are just, like I said, they're funny. Like the entire camp, we might be in the mess hall having a meal, and it might be like breakfast time, and everyone knows that it's breakfast time. You know, all the other older kids know that it's breakfast time, so they're sitting there eating. But man, those 3-year-olds, they love to choose that time to then go to the bathroom and just hang out in the bathroom and have fun. And they love to wash their hands and just show you how great they are at washing their hands. And like, they have just no concept of time whatsoever. And I love it because I'm very much like them. I believe full force that like time is a social construct. And so if you're going to get upset about losing time because you're, you know, off playing with bubbles, then, you know, whatever. But so I got excited actually that I was with like the most free-spirited group of the 3-year-olds, right? But so like I said about this being a sports camp though, so all of those activities that are scheduled for these kids are also acting like insulin when it comes to how their body's going to respond to these activities within this specific like critical criteria of monitoring their blood glucose concentration. So every time these kids are working out or being active or doing something that is physically active, that's acting like insulin. So if they just ate a meal and if they scheduled for however many units of insulin from that meal, so that way their blood glucose is in theory regulated from that meal, it's not going to be too high or too low. But then you factor in that they're going to go and work out also. Now you have to have added snacks, added carbohydrates right away available to them to raise their blood glucose if it does drop too low. And or you have to look back, and before they administer any insulin, you have to start to factor in the amount of activity. So it's this constant balancing act back and forth over and over and over again all throughout the day based on their meals, based on their activity, and based on how their body is responding to that combination of meals and activity. And then, like I said, the added benefit that normally we would be producing that hormone ourselves, so we wouldn't be monitoring and administering a hormone. But in this case, that's on them. That's something that is within their control, but it has to be within their control, because if it's not, then they succumb to how their body is responding to this combination, and that could be detrimental to them. Oh my God, it's such a cool concept to get in the nitty gritty of like how this works, and especially to get in conversations with type 1 diabetics about how they learn about their body and how they are using these different tools and techniques to identify how their body's responding. But so back to my story about the 3-year-olds. So this entire camp, all of these kids are scheduled like all throughout the day for sports. And so the older kids, they might have like kickball, and then they're going to go hiking, and then they're going to go and they'll be at the basketball courts playing knockout, and like they have like one thing after another, and they have like scheduled snacks there. So it's really easier. It's much easier for the counselors to have this constant tracking of everything, because they have these points in time that they can very clearly test and assess everyone, administer whatever snacks are needed. And so it's like, it's beautiful because it's scheduled out and perfectly organized, right? And then I have my group, and Miss Jen's group, man, they love butterflies. They love butterflies. And if I had something planned for us to do, but a butterfly comes up, they are chasing after that butterfly like you would not believe. And as soon as this happens, I have to start looking on my watch and start timing how long they are running around, because that literally is going to count as an activity that I now have to monitor their blood glucose based on them chasing after this butterfly. So I had to completely transition how I organized our days, really to have like a lack of organization. Really, like I said, I was paired up probably with the most perfect free-spirited little group there, because man, every time that butterfly came out, any butterfly, they were like, they butterflies. And so tracking everything and keeping consistently, like I had to carry a backpack with me at all times with every type of snack and drink you can imagine. every bit of it's like not even so much first aid as it is just glucose in all forms of foods and fluids and whatever kids will eat. We got to make sure that we have enough of it for all of them, depending on what is going on. Because of the fact that in this case, these are kids and they, again, don't have a sense of time. So all that cool timed out structure that the older kids can fall in line with, and that there's, a structure and order to it, man, that goes out the window when you got the little ones. So having to keep up with them and monitor and really to turn my perspective on play, on when they are playing, I have to time that and view that in terms of intensity of physical activity. So now I'm like, I can't just play with them. I have to like constantly monitor them and make sure that they're not playing too hard with those butterflies or those bubbles, because now we got to start, checking their levels and make sure that they have a snack available before we go and look at rocks. So yeah, super fun experience overall. But if anything though, like I said, it was the fact that this is such a unique population that has, you could say that there's very clearly a disadvantage of having to monitor and track everything that closely. But I see a different perspective of it, that it opens up so much more of our collective understanding of how the body works. And the fact that there are these things within our control outside of us, but these things outside of us are all these different lifestyle and environmental factors absolutely have this very strong impact on us. And we have to be that much more aware of how to point out what could be leading to what different changes within us. And also that much more clear on how to monitor these changes within us, because there is this constant interplay. And yeah, so hopefully that sparked some curiosity for a lot of you, that this is actually an entire world unto itself. And so, like I said, talking about glucose though, I'm going to get further into that topic over the next, I don't even know how many episodes I'm going to talk about it, because the concept of that glucose monitoring does in fact there's a key there that can translate to everyone. But the potential problem is finding the right tool to be able to actually monitor this in everyone, because it's not always as clear and easy to use one of these monitoring devices on someone who does not have these, dysregulated blood glucose. Or if you have normal, like regular steady blood glucose, you don't have any sort of a insulin resistance or an insulin deficiency like in diabetic populations, then your ability to monitor glucose changes you might not have enough sensitivity in those changes in your glucose concentrations for it to be picked up on a monitoring device. So there is a whole world of talking about just the monitoring devices itself and then what to do with it. But so hopefully that helped to spark some interest in the topic. And if anything, one little takeaway for you all today: if you ever feel like you're just bogged down with a heavy schedule and everything that you have to do is regimented and timed out and you have to be everywhere at every point in time, just take on that mentality of the 3-year-olds. And, if you need to be somewhere, maybe give yourself some extra time to enjoy washing your hands in the bathroom and show off how good you are washing your hands. And if you have a really diligent physical activity schedule, you're regimented on making sure you get physically active, make sure that you schedule some time for play. In fact, don't even schedule time for play. Allow yourself to get caught up with a butterfly and go and play. All right. Bye, everyone.